All right, so our next speaker, Ben Knight, is the co-founder of Loomio, an activist-driven co-op, an open-source software tool for democratic organizing. You are not going to want to miss this session. Now, we're at the Marin Center, just a stone's throw away from Silicon Valley, or maybe a 2-hour traffic commute. And Silicon Valley is a place where people go to change the world. It's a place for creativity and inventing the future. But we at Bioneers, we recognize the techno-utopian narrative that often dominates this culture. Amidst all the talk of billion-dollar unicorns and the cult of disruption, we at Bioneers recognize the all-too-familiar patterns of corporate greed and hubris, a system that can reinforce the worst effects of massive income inequality, racial and gender discrimination, and environmental destruction. But the fact remains, we are undergoing a digital transformation on this planet right now. With 3 billion people already connected via smartphones and computers, the opportunity for rapid mobilization of large-scale social movements and change has never been greater. As Jensine Larson from World Pulse remarked yesterday, we can turn information technology into relationship technology. But to accomplish this, we must actually use and embrace the tools at our disposal. We must embed into our actions and design into these new systems an emphasis on openness, diversity, fairness, and collective action. Ben Knight and his amazing team of collaborators at Loomio are pioneers in these new cooperative paradigms. Loomio is a part of the Inspiral network. Now, Inspiral is a community of a whole bunch of social enterprises that are building appropriate technology solutions to tackle social and environmental challenges. And it's no accident that both Loomio and Inspiral come from Aotearoa, New Zealand, a country that is incubating a wide range of these integrated solutions and birthing a movement of passionate change makers working together to make positive global impact. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Ben Knight.
Thank you, Matthew. So just between you and me, this is by far the biggest room I've ever spoken in. But it's also by far the warmest, most compassionate and loving crowd that I've ever spoken to. So I think it's going to be okay. So I'm just going to share a bit about my story, my journey over the last few years that's led me to be standing here in front of you. So until a few years ago, I was going rapidly down this academic track, this quite traditional academic pathway. I'd started a PhD in evolutionary psychology. I was really interested in collective intelligence, and particularly interested in this phenomenon called cumulative cultural evolution, which is like a fancy academic way of saying, everything that we have, everything that we know, everything that we do is based on this foundation and layer upon layer upon layer of learning over generations. Everything we have comes on top of everything that's come before and every person that's come before. And as far as we know, as far as Western science knows at least, humans are the only species that exhibits this, the only species that does this, that has this ratchet effect or this accumulation over time. So put kind of bluntly or crudely, it's this question of why humans are the only species that's becoming collectively more intelligent over time. And so to study this question, I just heard someone say, "Who says?" which I think is great, because I totally agree. The Western scientific industrial complex says. So, so I got sent to Texas, to a tiny town about an hour out of Austin, and I was working with this amazing community of chimpanzees in a primate sanctuary, teaching them, working with them to learn to use touchscreens, to see if there was, basically to see if we were asking the wrong question, to see if people had been asking the wrong question. And it was, it was really interesting work on a theoretical level. And I'd gotten into this work because of, sort of from an animal rights background, and I'd seen the power of, when people think about the human species as a species among other species, humans as animals among other animals, rather than as separate from, distinct to nature, there can be something really powerfully transformative in that. But the reality of doing this work, and then every night going home, going online, and just being bombarded by images, by news, by information about all of these things going horribly, horribly wrong in the world, like full-scale ecological collapse, like an economic paradigm that is so extractive that it's literally threatening the capacity of the Earth to sustain life going forward. That's literally threatening all of our futures. And there was this urgency to these challenges, this real sort of visceral urgency that I was feeling on this. And my initial question just got pushed right out by a question that felt much, much more urgent. And that is, well, if we're really getting so much more intelligent, then why is it that our biggest institutions, our political institutions, our economic institutions, the way that they're behaving collectively, is like the epitome of stupidity? It's not intelligent. So the work I was doing, the collective intelligence sort of lens, looking at this question, it's kind of not that surprising that we're in this position in a way. Like, it's crazy, it's absurd, but it's not that surprising if you think about the shape of our dominant institutional forms. If you think about the organizational structures that make up the bulk of the institutions in our economic system, in our political system, they're these centralized, you centralize the power, you centralize the wealth, you centralize everything right at the top in this tiny number of people. And those people are expected to make decisions on behalf of everyone else. And I mean, it's just this kind of crazy situation where, what else do we expect, really? Like, when we've got these archaic systems that involve people who are so far removed from the impact of their actions and the actions of the institutions that they have control over, the situation we're in is suddenly not so surprising. In terms of like where this put me, where this put my head, all this stuff is running through my head, and I'm just feeling more and more like the academic institution is this kind of, it's this very powerful way of accumulating knowledge, but it feels like this sort of disembodied brain that's like just floating up there, like acquiring knowledge for the sake of acquiring knowledge, without thinking through the impact on the real world and the impact on practical challenges, huge scale challenges that we're facing with increasing urgency. And I mean, the term academic industrial complex, like, I don't use that lightly. If you trace the funding that's funding this research, if you trace the value that comes out of the knowledge that's produced and where that goes, like, it really is a part of a very dark mechanical system. And as I was going through this inner turmoil, one day at the primate sanctuary, I was offered by one of the senior staff a tour of this he came up to me and said, "Oh, do you want a tour? You've been here for a month. Do you want a tour of the other part of the facility?" And I didn't know there was another part of the facility. And so he led me across this compound and down this hallway and into this building that had no windows, which was kind of curious, and through room after room of tiny cages full of, like, literally thousands, 3,000 owl monkeys and squirrel monkeys in isolation. So they keep the chimpanzees are out front. They don't do invasive biomedical research. They put them on display. They house them in family groups. Behind closed doors, they're breeding thousands of owl monkeys and squirrel monkeys to sell into biomedical research and pharmaceutical testing. And this realization that my work was legitimizing that level of suffering was really difficult, really, really difficult. So we got out of it, like. And I went back to New Zealand, and back to Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I'd grown up. And I got involved in community organizing and just had this burning desire to work with real people in real communities on real problems. And so I got involved with an arts collective, a collective of artists and musicians in New Zealand that were organizing around social justice issues, around Indigenous rights, around environmental issues. We were organizing in resistance to state surveillance. It led down this crazy pathway where I woke up with police in my room in the middle of the night with torches. I had 2 computers stolen. It was a crazy situation. For the crime of organizing benefit concerts and art exhibitions to support environmental groups. So even in New Zealand, at the bottom of the world, this stuff is happening, this stuff is playing out. And then 2011, something really interesting started happening. And for me, this was an experience of going online and being just bombarded by images of something quite different. Images of people all over the world mobilizing in huge numbers, coming out in the streets to say, this has got to stop. Like, this institutional insanity that's seriously threatening all of our futures, it's got to stop. We've at least got to talk about it, and we've got to talk about it openly and publicly. So this wave of social movements through Tunisia, through Tahrir Square in Cairo, through to Latin America and Spain, the Indignados and the 15M movement, all with this sort of parallel, this wave of activity, and then landing in Wall Street, right? Occupy Wall Street, the occupation of Zuccotti Park, and then from there to more than 800 cities around the world, all at the same time. Massive mobilizations, like I had never seen, this movement of movements. Even in faraway little old New Zealand. So the bottom left there, you can tell it's New Zealand because in the back, because everything's smaller, and because in the background there's this awful statue of these rugby players reaching for a rugby ball. So this is Wellington. This is Wellington, New Zealand, the capital. And what I saw play out there was just totally transformative for me. It was this experience of people just coming together with this shared sense of injustice and the need to do something about that injustice, economic injustice, political injustice, like just every form of injustice. And the thing that really, really struck me was the parallels between what was happening in New Zealand that I had this lived experience of and what was happening in literally 800 cities around the world. These 3 features of those movements that really struck me, and these are all kind of horrible academic jargon terms, but they refer to very important and actually quite simple concepts. So intersectionality, it's a fancy word for the idea that all oppression is connected, all injustice is connected. We all know it, right? But the media narrative around Occupy was, oh, these people don't know what they're talking about because they care about the environment and they care about indigenous rights. And that's crazy. You can't have two demands. You need one. But there was this real understanding of intersectionality in that movement. Transformative change rather than this traditional conception of revolution. That was such a strong thread for me. And this was, just this idea that, well, the change we need is systemic. It's not this old paradigm of revolutionary change where you just take out the people who are currently in power, replace them with other people that you hope will do a better job, and what happens? You end up in the same situation pretty quick. So the need for real systemic change. And then prefigurative, the most jargony term of all. But it's just, this notion that it's really important that we're conscious and that we organize in ways that are in alignment, in coherence with the change that we're trying to make in the world, the change that we want to see in the world. So if we want a more democratic, more equitable, more sustainable planet, we need to organize ourselves, our movements, our organizations, our communities in sustainable, equitable ways. And the lived experience of this, again through a collective intelligence lens, I couldn't quite leave the academic interpretations behind, but just seeing the collective intelligence of a group, of a community, when every perspective can genuinely be heard, when people sit in a circle. The power of circles was just something that I had had no experience in before. When people are deeply listening to each other, genuinely taking diverse perspectives into account and synthesizing that through a process of building collective understanding, groups come to better decisions than any individual would by themselves. And seeing that play out, but also seeing the shadow side of it, seeing what happens when the process is not well held, seeing what happens when informal power dynamics. There's this really brilliant paper by Joe Freeman in the 1970s in the women's movement called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And it's just this very, very compelling, concise, relatable description of these informal power dynamics that emerge when people aren't taking account of the way that power flows in their organizations and their networks, and how destructive that can be. And some of this is due to, interpersonal dynamics. It's sort of the selection pressure that comes with like this mode of organizing. It suits some people better than others. It privileges the loudest voices. It privileges the dominant demographics. It privileges people who have the time that aren't, raising families, that aren't locked in 9-to-5 jobs. It privileges people who can be in the same place at the same time. And it leaves out all of the others. It excludes everyone else. So we're sitting there grappling with this. And we're in this tough position where the two dominant paradigms are both broken. Sure, this is not a pyramid, but it's another shape that also doesn't serve our movement. It's this uncoordinated, disorganized blob that has real trouble having any impact in the real world, has real trouble organizing meaningful impact. So we're in this paradigm where the two dominant modes of decision-making, top-down decision-making, we all know what's wrong with it. It can be fast and clear. That's the justification for rigid chains of command. It can also be disempowering and exclusionary. Like, you're leaving most people out of the process in order for it to go quickly. Bottom-up organizing can be amazingly inclusive and empowering. It can be this totally transformative experience, and it can be the worst experience of your entire life. When you have this 8-hour meeting and nothing gets decided, it can be so slow and fragile, and there's this almost always white man, middle-aged white man yelling at everyone else. Not always, but a lot of the time. And so a group of us came together during Occupy around this idea that there must be a better way of doing things. Like, a lot has changed since these dominant paradigms came into existence, many, many hundreds of years ago. One thing that's changed is that we now have something called the internet. And so, it's this interconnected infrastructure, communications infrastructure, by which so many of us, like literally billions of us now, are more connected than we ever have been in the past. So surely we can figure out some way of using that enormous resource that communications infrastructure, to figure out how to do collective decision-making in a way that's inclusive and empowering and fast and clear, to break this trade-off between effectiveness and inclusion and have both. So we got to work. It was at exactly that time, just by chance, that activists, a bunch of us from the Occupy movement, came into contact with a community called Inspiral. So they were literally, so we're sitting in a park in Civic Square, camping in tents. They're sitting in a co-working space, literally 5 minutes away, talking about all of the same things, just using slightly different language and different techniques of getting there. This is a community of people committed to building, as Matthew said, building appropriate technologies to tackle different environmental and social challenges. So this covers, some groups are looking at peer-to-peer community education, some are looking at organic food distribution, youth mental health, and they're building sustainable social enterprises to scale the impact that these ventures can have. So we turned up and we said, hey, we've had this really great idea. We heard that you're good with computers. Can you build this thing for us so we can get back to the tents and do the important work of sitting in a circle? And they told us that, well, that'd be really nice, but we actually need that tool as well, because we say we're a non-hierarchical network that's, that's autonomous. But in reality, most of our decisions come down to one or two people because we can't get everyone in the same room at the same time. So they were like, well, we'll give you a desk and an internet connection, and we'll build it together. So this team started gravitating around this idea. People from backgrounds in business, in activism, in technology, in the community sector, just this very intergenerational team of people came together around this idea. And over the next few months, it came to be known, as we wrote the first code and just hacked together this very, very clunky prototype, it came to be known as Loomio. So loom as in like a loom for weaving diverse perspectives into a coherent whole that's stronger than the sum of its parts. And loom as in illumination, the illumination that comes with collective wisdom when all perspectives are heard. And it's this very simple tool. It basically amounts to a pie graph and 4 buttons and a place to talk to each other. It's an online space for purpose-driven groups of people to come together, talk something through, build shared understanding just through dialogue, and build agreement around clear courses of action. So to shift from not just mobilization, not just discussion, but that through that flow to real-world action. I'll just show you a concrete example just to sort of make it real, because when people talk about technology, often it's this weird invisible thing. So this is a group of humans. This is a youth climate action network called Generation Zero, who are doing seriously inspiring work in New Zealand, pushing for a carbon zero future. So they've been using Loomio from the very, very early days, involving a larger community, a nationwide network, and decisions about the direction that the movement takes. So within a group, anyone can start a discussion. So in this case, someone started a discussion, fairly open topic. What are we going to do about, what's the movement's tactics on reducing transport emissions? So the group just talks. They just talk it through. When someone in the group thinks that they've got an idea that might serve a course of action they could propose, anyone can put up a proposal. So a proposal is just like a clear course of action. I think we should do this. What does everyone else think? And so people participate in the decision by clicking one of 4 buttons. And when you make your decision, you give a Twitter length, short, concise statement explaining why you've made the decision you've made. So there's always a rationale, a reason behind it. And you keep talking. When concerns are raised, you talk them through. And you adapt the proposal to address the concerns. So you're not stuck. You don't get this binary yes-no thing where you're pitted against each other. So groups that use this really well, they build agreement, they address concerns on the way through in the dialogue, and they come to solutions, they come to an agreed course of action that they all get behind. And over the next few months, so we got this prototype up, the co-working space starts using it, the whole Inspiral network starts using it, some activist groups, environmental groups, and then this crazy thing happens where city councils, city governments start using it. It spreads to conference organizers in India and grocery cooperatives in San Francisco and schools, democratically organized schools, and just this amazing network of purpose-driven organizations pushing for change in the same general direction and all embracing tools to enable them to organize themselves to get there. And so to this point, over the last 3 years, with no pushing from us, because we're this tiny team at the bottom of the world just trying to figure all this stuff out, has led to more than 20,000 groups making more than 30,000 decisions. And this is what makes it all worthwhile. So one of the first large-scale international use outside of New Zealand of Loomio was in the Hungarian student movement. So we were still in closed beta, which means we weren't open for public signups. But we got this request from a youth activist network that was saying, we're a bunch of university students, we want to organize against government education cuts. And I wasn't supposed to approve it, but I did. And then the next day, we got a request from a network of academics and professors that were organizing nationwide in support of the student movement, so I approved it. Then we got a request from a network of high school students all around Hungary, and their request, the email they sent through it really burned in my mind. We're a network of high school students all around Hungary that are organizing democratically to express our revulsion to the government for their proposed education cuts. And I wish I could have been that articulate in an email when I was at high school. So they mobilized really effectively. They organized protests all over the country. They occupied university buildings, government buildings. They got the government to back down on the proposed cuts. At the beginning of last year in Taiwan, the Sunflower Movement, this enormous mobilization of young people, well, predominantly young people, not entirely young people, but this enormous mobilization of citizens in Taiwan who didn't think that the government's secrecy around a trade deal they were negotiating with China was okay. So 150,000 people surrounded Parliament. They got inside the legislature, the Parliament building. They occupied it for 3 weeks. They got the government to back down and open up transparency around this trade deal they were negotiating. And the craziest part of this is that because the student protesters took the code, Loomio's open source, so anyone can take the code. They took the code, they translated it into their own language, and so now, 12 months later, the Taiwanese government is using Loomio to involve citizens in policymaking, collaborative policymaking. Really positive step. So this is Puerto del Sol in Madrid, so the seat of the 15M movement, which actually inspired a lot of the energy that came into the Occupy movement and the tactics that were used that then inspired us. Loomio has now sort of gone full circle, and activists, like many thousands of activists, 25% of all of our traffic comes from Spain, people using it in Spanish, community-based activist groups. Massive, massive mobilizations. This is an anti-austerity protest in the last, I think it was about 3 months ago, like really massive citizen mobilization. And an example very close to home that's very dear to my heart is there's this amazing organization called Action Station in New Zealand. They're an Inspiral social enterprise. They provide an online citizen mobilization platform, petition site, like really impressive work. There are six amazing ancient Pohutukawa trees in Auckland. And Pohutukawa trees, I don't know if there are some in California. Apparently they wreak havoc with drainage, with plumbing, and their roots go really deep. But in New Zealand, they're adapted to the land, and they have real cultural significance for a lot of people in New Zealand, but particularly the tangata whenua, particularly the indigenous people of New Zealand. They have these bright red flowers that are like, they represent the blood of fallen warriors, so deeply significant trees. The Auckland Council and the Transport Agency had plans to, they wanted to cut down all of these ancient trees, and so that they could expand the road to make room for more cars, which is maybe not what many people here would think we needed. So this group just self-organized, they just mobilized really quickly, these defenders of trees. And they used Action Station to mobilize a huge number of people. Then they jumped into Loomio to self-organize. Action Station were like, great that you've mobilized. Stop asking us what you should do next. You should self-organize. Here's a Loomio group. Get together and figure out what you want to do. So they staged protests. They staged, they wrote open letters. They staged a media campaign. The trees are still standing. And they're the only trees that I know of that have their own Twitter account. So like being tweeted at by trees that were saved by people who were able to organize really effectively, and for us to have played some tiny role in that is just like, that's why we get out of bed every day. And so this is the group of people that I get to work with every day. So this is the Loomio Cooperative. We've, this notion of prefigurative politics, prefigurative organizing, we've taken that really to heart. We've baked that into the core of our organization. We're a democratically run, collaboratively owned cooperative. We're a social enterprise. We're very careful about where we take our funding from and where we don't. Which the technology industry sorely needs, like really sorely needs that consideration. So where does that leave us now? It feels like we're at this real knife-edge moment, and I hear this coming through a lot of the talks here, but we're at this sort of, this point in history where we're more connected than ever before. So the internet in particular, but other forms of communication, this could be this enormously liberating force, this hugely liberating force where we use that infrastructure to genuinely listen to each other and to organize around collective action. It can also be the most terrifying mechanism of control that we have ever seen. And it's kind of both at once right now. And it's up to us which way we go on that. So when I look out into this room, I see a huge number of amazing people working on really, really important things, and each of those people is connected to a much, much larger network. The amount of power that's in this room right now, this is this densely interconnected accumulation of nodes and a network. And the task that we have in front of us is to translate that mobilized energy that's in this room right now and feed it out into every edge of every network that we're connected to. And that is why this is seriously the first time, the most hopeful that I have felt in a very, very long time. So thank you.